Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So following Laura's presentations, I will be myself drawing on insights on how Italian divorced and separated families dealt with lockdown. So I was responsible for the Italian fieldwork in this big ERC project. And I did a first wave of data collection from March 2017 to March 2018. And then a follow-up wave of data collection was aimed to take place in March 2020. But as you all know, by then I was unable to fly back to Turin and do this data collection in person, as we were all in Italy as well as in Belgium under a strict lockdown. So I conducted these follow-up interviews online, but this also became an opportunity to question these families on how they had organized or reorganized shared custody during lockdown. This presentation thus focuses on data collection on this specific topic of how they dealt with lockdown. And our results were published in a paper in the journal Family Research. And if you're interested in the wider analysis of the Italian case, you can consult our website for that. And just maybe some quick information on family profiles that participated in our research. These were families that were practicing shared physical custody from spending 30 to 70% of the time with each parent to 50-50, but actually most of the parents of the families, that participated practice an egalitarian shared physical custody, so 50% of the time with each parent. The majority of families were from middle class socioeconomic levels, and while half of them, were experiencing low levels of conflict, the other half did experience mild to severe levels of conflict. So the research question we asked was, what impact did lockdown have on those family arrangements? Here we are in a situation where mobility clashes with a very immobile context, right? So more precisely, we wondered how these families adapted to the lockdown situation, and what did these adaptations tell us about structural factors and inequalities shaping post-divorce family life in Italy. And we were particularly interested in gender dynamics and inequalities, since Italy is a country that is still characterized by strong gender inequalities and the centrality of mothers as main carers. And so just few elements of context, also with regards to the Italian context, there are several aspects that sort of discourage the practice of egalitarian shared physical custody arrangements. The 2006 law on affido condiviso, which is generally called the joint custody law, actually does not hold any indication on how this should translate in terms of shared residence. So in other words, parents are required to share responsibility of their children, but there's no indication on sleepovers, for instance, and an equality of nights spent in each home. This is why we prefer talking about shared legal custody in the case of Italy instead of shared physical custody. There's also a regulation called collocamento that entails the family dwelling pre-separation can be attributed to either one of the parents, and in the vast majority of cases, this is the mother. I can tell you more about this if you're interested. I'm not going to go too much in detail now, but this is something to keep in mind. And our large study highlights also that post-divorce, mothers play a key role in following up with schoolwork, especially since Italy has a school system where school ends at around 1 or 2 p.m. most generally, and children have a lot of homework to do. And since they have a lot of school books linked to each material, they usually tend to come back to their mothers for homework, regardless of where they're sleeping that night. This is also something I can elaborate more if you're interested, but it's just a few elements I wanted to provide for context. And then a few words on the theoretical framework we used for this study. Building on the works of French sociologist Danilo Martuccelli, we conceptualize lockdown as a challenge trial. It's épreuve défi in French, which is defined as historical challenges, socially produced and unequally distributed, that individuals must face. So challenge trials like lockdown then profoundly disrupt the routines of life and engage a vision of individuals as actors. They represent a powerful analytical operator to describe and understand how individuals cope with changes, and to understand the structures also and phenomena of society which become more visible in challenges. And this also includes the family sphere. Trials are indeed moments in which the places and roles occupied by family members are played out, where social actors reposition themselves and where social structures, relations, and inequalities are revealed. And in this paper, we operationalize the challenge trials framework through a focus on daily practices through which people do family. Family practices are the activities that family members do in relation with one another and through which they affirm, reaffirm, produce, reproduce, and define, redefine their family relationships. Here we particularly look at childcare practices and time. So especially linked to the definition and management of the rhythms of alternation between homes. This led us to build a typology that crosses 2 dimensions in relation to 3 sets of practices. So the 2 dimensions are if there was a change or not in the sleepover schedule. This is one big point we looked at. And the second dimension was if the arrangements were the same or different for siblings. And we examine practices in relation to 3 aspects. One is the circulation of paid work, childcare, and the articulation, of paid work, childcare, and schoolwork. Second are material constraints, so housing space, internet connections. And the third is the relational dimension. And by crossing these dimensions and practices, we outlined 4 types of family reorganization during lockdown. So all of our families could be categorized in one of these 4 types. One is concerns families that put shared physical custody on hold and where the role of the mother as main carer was reinforced. Because they stayed put in one specific place, and in these cases, it was systematically at the mothers. Second type concerns families that maintained a relative status quo. Third type are families where we observed an increased involvement of the father through splitting the custody of children. I'll get more into detail into this in a minute. And the fourth type concerns families where the mother as main carer was reinforced through different arrangements for siblings. So let's look at these more closely. In type 1, these arrangements, so putting shared physical custody on hold, these arrangements were motivated in 2 cases by concerns around the child's well-being, with mothers having access to housing that was more appropriate for lockdown, either because their own house was better suited or because they could stay at the grandparents' house in the countryside where they could enjoy long walks and fresh air. In 2 cases, fears of circulating the virus motivated this arrangement. For instance, because the father was caring for his aged mother and feared the circulation of the kids might contaminate her. And these arrangements were also possible because all 4 mothers either didn't have to work during lockdown or could easily adapt their working schedules, which was less the case for fathers in this type. So yeah, as I stressed, these families that put SPC on hold, all children spent the whole lockdown at their mothers without circulating. Type 2, this was so maintaining a relative status quo, so very few changes. This was often motivated by past or present parental conflict, and parents didn't dare to ask to change the established calendar for fear of relaunching conflict, and just went on with what had been in place pre-COVID. However, in this case, in this type, we did observe some changes in the amount of daytime that was spent in each residence. In this case, the closure of schools played a role, as it could no longer be the place where the transition between residences happened, because the physical location of school was closed. They did have remote teaching, but they could not do the home swapping through a school day. So for instance, just to give an example, in one case, the children used to spend Mondays and Tuesdays at their mothers, and they usually go to their dads right after school on Wednesdays and go back to their mothers on Fridays after school if this was the weekend they spent there. Since the father was required to work in hospitals during lockdown, he couldn't be available at midday when school closed to maintain the usual arrangements in that context, whereas the self-employed mother working remotely from home could be more flexible in organizing her work schedule. And so during lockdown, because of school closure and working requirements, the father would pick up his boys on Wednesday nights, evenings actually, at their mothers right before dinner. So then the children would spend the whole Wednesday at their mothers instead of at their mothers, instead of being in school. Then the father would arrange to have very few patients on Thursday, so he just had to leave for 2 or 3 hours and leaving the children briefly alone. And on Fridays of the mother's weekend, instead of the mother's getting her children back after a school day, the father would drop the kids off in the morning before going to work. And so here too, the children would spend an extra daytime with their mother. Type 3, in this type, we observed an increasing paternal involvement linked to the fact of splitting siblings. So parents in this type would each host 1 or more children at the same time and then switch the children. So this was because children often asked to do so themselves, usually because they were starting to fight too much with each other. This was also linked to housing space, which was sometimes very constrained, and of internet speed, which could become a problem when everyone is teleworking or following lessons at the same time. And this is nicely highlighted in the following quote from Family Viola. So the mother states, I quote, "For the first 2 weeks, then also due to a problem of availability of computers to provide connections for school as well as our work from home, we just had to separate, as they, the children themselves, requested, because they couldn't stand each other. In fact, when they were all in the father's place, the apartment being so small, a few clashes broke out. So we separated them so that on Mondays and Tuesdays, one was with me and the other went there at the father's. And on Wednesdays, we exchanged them." So fathers in this, end of quote. So fathers in this type had to take on more care responsibilities of their children, as there was always one of them living with them. During lockdown, this was, however, not experienced so much as a burden, as it also allowed parents to enjoy company instead of loneliness. That was characteristic of this strange time. And type 4, this only concerned one family, a family Rosso, in which the youngest children had a fixed calendar of home swaps between mother and father, but the eldest son was already alternating pre-COVID following his desires and needs, and considered his mother's home as his main place of residence, where he had invested most materially. He didn't actually really have his own space at his father's, and he did have his own room at his mother's. And pre-COVID, this oldest son considered his dad's home more as a convenient location, being near where he liked to go out and relax with friends. So when everything shut down and occasions for seeing his friends vanished, he decided to remain mostly at his mother's, where he felt more at home. And his parents didn't oppose this. So the mother, being a physical therapist, was unable to work during lockdown. The father mostly was off work, but sometimes had to go physically to work. And this entailed that the mother always had one child, the eldest, at home, and the two smaller children were alternating. So this was a case when siblings were split. They didn't alternate together, but that reinforced the mother as main carer. And so just to end briefly, we observed kind of changing gendered parenting practices during lockdown. The lockdown had actually opposite effects throughout our respondents, reinforcing the mothers as main carers in some cases and increasing fathers' involvement in other cases. In the case of fathers, the key novelties lied in the fact that some fathers spent more daytime with children than they did before, and also that some fathers constantly hosted at least one child during lockdown, forcing them to engage in new caring practices that they less did before. Some of the key structural factors that we observed shaping these new arrangements include material constraints, so the need for space, computers, and stable internet connections. Second, gender inequalities in the labor market, with mothers already in part-time and more flexible jobs, so it was easier for them to adapt to their children. And then the physical closure of schools allowed parents to put in place more egalitarian custody arrangements, as children no longer had to come back to the house where they usually did homework, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. This research opened up to new questions for future research. We saw that shared physical custody was experienced more as a resource to face lockdown, allowing for mobility and seeing people, or allowing for mobility and actually seeing different people in a time of isolation. We also observed the importance of further counting sleepovers as well as daytime spent in each home in order to understand family and care practices better. And this relates to Davy's concept of shared care families, which we think applies nicely to our case, and it's a promising avenue for future research on SPC. And finally, our study highlights the need to complexify the study of sibling relations in SPC, which is often viewed as siblings moving together, which here wasn't so much the case. So it's something we definitely should look into more. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your questions.